Leafcutter ants are pretty cool, and that's because they're more or less the only animal that can do farming, other than humans of course, and so I've been really keen to work them into the ant colony video game that I've been building. These ants can now harvest leaves, and carry the pieces back to their fungus farms, and use that to grow edible food. Now, since I'm making a video game, this simulation is meant to be fun to play around with, rather than being 100% scientifically accurate. And so I've taken some creative liberties here and there, like how the ants live in little houses instead of in regular dirt mounds. Let me show you how I made all of this. But first of all, the game has changed a whole bunch since the last video, so let's start over from the beginning. You play as an ant colony, and you can direct your ants using pheromone trails that you draw by clicking on a building and dragging a trail. The ants will then run out and collect resources of all different kinds, and these resources will be taken back to their homes. As you collect resources, you'll fill out milestones that you can see up in the corner here. And each time you hit a milestone, you get given some coins with which you can build more buildings, and so this forms a basic gameplay loop. You place your buildings which contain ants. Then you use trails to direct the ants to gather resources. These resources fill up milestones, and the milestones earn you coins that you can use to place more buildings. Video games are always built out of gameplay loops like this, and this is the one that I've chosen for my game. But I'm also adding a second loop, because I want to let you upgrade your ant colony and evolve it in all sorts of different ways. So you can have a colony that does leaf cutting, and maybe a different one that does aphid farming, or even keeps bees or stuff like that. And so for this second gameplay loop, I'm adding a new mechanic, radium. The idea is you collect the radium, and because it's radioactive, it lets you evolve your colony and unlock upgrades to do new things, adapting them for each level. For this reason, before we add the leaf cutting mechanics, let's first add this evolution mechanic. So my concept was to spawn these rocks in the level, which the ants can then be told to crack open. When you smash one of the rocks, it drops a big green crystal made of radium that they can then carry back to their home. When I loaded the graphics into the game, I felt they looked a bit flat, so I decided to split the rock graphics into two separate sprites, one for the rock part and one for the crystal parts. And this lets me use a different shader for each sprite, so I can make them look different. In particular, I can make the crystal bits shinier. This shiny effect was taken from another shader that I've written previously, and the idea is really quite simple. You start with these scrolling diagonal white lines, and then you can raise the brightness of the sprite wherever this white line passes over. And in order to make this effect just a little bit more interesting, you can also take it in reverse, where you shift the timing of that white line based on the original brightness of the sprite. So a brighter area of the sprite will glint slightly before a darker area glints, and that variation makes the effect look more interesting and makes it a little bit harder for the player to figure out. Now let's start on the programming. For the purpose of the gameplay, I want the radium to have nice round numbers, with every evolution costing 1 radium, or maybe 2, rather than one costing 17 and another costing 24 and all that kind of nonsense. But right now, the way that the mechanics work is that the ants collect and carry resources in these tiny little fragments called crumbs. And so you'll gather crumbs a dozen at a time. Because of this, let's add a new mechanic where the ants can all work together to carry a single large object as a team. This is how real ants carry heavy objects, and it's also a mechanic that you can see in the Pikmin games. When the rock is broken, it drops some resources. These small bits are the crumbs that I was talking about before, and the big crystal is what I'm now calling a nugget. Crumbs only need a single ant to carry them, but nuggets can have several ants help out. When you have lots of different characters working together like this, the coding can get quite tricky. especially because I'm simulating different ants on different CPU cores in order to make the game run much faster. And this makes it tricky for the ants to share information between each other. So I came up with a nifty workaround. Whenever an ant picks up or puts down a nugget, it sends a message to that nugget, and these messages allow each nugget to figure out how many ants are currently connected to it. And then the nugget can actually walk itself towards the goal, with a speed based on this information, and the ants just follow it along. Visually, this looks exactly the same as the ants working together to carry the nugget, but because the code is centralized inside of one entity, which is the nugget itself, it's much easier to program it this way around. Anyway, that's all working as expected, but we're going to have to juice this up a little bit. So I made this particle effect. I really enjoy making these kinds of particle effects, but it can be a bit tricky. You have a lot of freedom in how you make particles move, and these effects are often layered up out of multiple different particle systems, and so it takes a bit of practice to know how to really get started. One tip I would give is that you can run your particle effect in slow motion in order to figure out more clearly if you like how it looks, and to iron out bits that seem like they don't fit in or that aren't meshing very well. This particular effect is made up of 4 different particle systems. We have these background dust puffs that fill up the space and obscure the crystal behind as its graphics are destroyed. This helps the destroy animation look a little bit smoother because it's being partially covered up. We also have a quick flash to grab the player's attention. This can be seen quite well out of the player's peripheral vision because it's a bright white. It can draw attention. And to emphasize this a little bit more, we have these sparks that leap out of the flash, and they give the effect a little bit more oomph. And finally, I've added a second level of dust puffs that are smaller and they linger behind for longer, and this gives the effect a little bit more presence and duration. And so that's the final effect. We're also going to need a sound effect. Personally, I get most of my sound effects from Motion Array, and then I just modify them slightly, adjusting the duration and the volume and things like that. Sometimes I also modify their pitch or equalize them, or perhaps even combine a few different sounds together into one. But it's all quite simple stuff really, and it helps to have a library that you can draw on for the base of the sounds. I also added some subtle screen shake when the rock is broken. I could turn this up a little bit more, but I know some people really don't like screen shake, it gives them headaches, and so until I've added a proper option to the menu to turn it off, I don't really want to add too much of it in. But altogether, I think this effect looks way better now. It's always debatable whether spending development time on this sort of thing pays off, because at the end of the day, graphics are no substitute for good gameplay. But I do think it makes an impact on how the game feels and how the player feels playing it, so you have to try and strike a balance, I guess, and I'm still learning exactly where that balance is. Next, I added an evolution counter to the HUD. Every time you collect one of these crystals, it ticks upwards. And then I built this evolution menu to let you choose your next evolution. This sort of stuff is always tricky to program and can take a long time. You have to make all of the buttons look good, and you have to make them respond when you highlight and when you click on them and all that sort of stuff. And you also have to make sure that you're properly sandboxing the game's controls so you're not accidentally interacting with the game behind the menu while it's open. There's a lot of subtle ways that a menu like this can go wrong. But fortunately, I already had a similar menu in a previous prototype, so I was able to adapt that one rather than starting from scratch. Now what we're going to need is an icon for our leaf cutting evolution, and of course some special effects. And now we can evolve our ants to become leaf cutters. Now obviously, farming is all about sustainability, and so there needed to be a way to make the plants that you are harvesting renewable. In other words, they need to have a growth life cycle. This throws up a couple of problems. With the art style that I've chosen for the game, there are no outlines on any of the graphics. I think this gives the game a nice, clean, illustrational feeling, but the downside is that it means you can't really have graphics overlap each other, especially if they are a similar colour, because then they just blend into one. And this creates problems if the plant is able to grow taller. Secondly, I also wanted to make sure that the ants aren't harvesting the plants too early, right? Because if ants are constantly crawling over this forest of plants, and the forest is constantly planting new buds that slowly grow upwards, well, the ants would naturally just end up harvesting all the buds, and your forest would never look particularly well grown and well taken care of. So the solution to both of these problems was to have a mechanic where the plants first grow larger and then mature. And they mature basically when they run out of space to grow larger. This stops them from ever overlapping, because if there's space they grow, and if there's no space they mature, and then once they've matured you can then have the ants harvest them. And this means that the forest that they're using for their leaf cutting always looks like it's growing, and always looks quite full and busy. And so I made this graphics for a basic leafy plant that has 4 growth stages, and where at each stage it can mature. Then we just need, once again, some more particle effects and sound effects. I think it's a lot of fun to watch the ants collect these leaves and bring them home in orderly lines. Now, leafcutter ants have a unique silhouette, the way that they carry their large section of leaf above them. Often the section of leaf is much larger than the ant itself, and they hold it in this upright pattern that makes it look even bigger. And currently in the game, the leaves that they're collecting look a bit more like pebbles than leaves. They're sort of like little round blobs. And so I figured it was probably worth the time investment to improve this a little bit. First, I took away the bounciness of the crumbs, because obviously leaves don't bounce. And then I added some floatiness so that they would sink gradually to the ground, and it simulates that little bit of wind resistance that leaves have. And then I added this little fluttering effect where they spin around in various directions as they fall, and once they hit the ground, they lie flat, making them a little bit shorter. I have set this up so that these properties are all reusable on other crumb types. So we could have some crumbs be solid objects, some be drops of water, some be more leaf-like, and I can animate each of them a bit differently, which I think will add quite a lot to the juiciness of the game in the long run. And now you can see the final result of this gameplay after the extra polish has been added. Okay, so our ants are collecting the leaves, that's good, but now we have to use them. You might think that leafcutter ants eat the leaves, but they don't. These leaves are used as a fertilizer to grow a special fungus. And this fungus actually is adapted to the leafcutter colony, and in many cases the fungus actually can't live without the ants. They're symbiotic in that way. So in other words, the ants are farming in a very literal sense. And so I wanted to make sure that the game mechanics really do feel like farming. So I came up with these 3 new building types: farms, compost, and sprinklers. And they're each going to have a slightly different purpose. And we'll cover that in just a second. I also created this little circle meter, which lets your buildings be charged up and then trigger an effect once they've been fully charged. And finally, we also needed these mushroom graphics, which also have growing and maturing steps, like I talked about earlier. To make testing all of this easier, I also added some storage bins. They're quite simple, really. One ant trail can carry resources over to the bin and store them inside the bin, and then a different ant trail can take resources out of the bin for their own purposes. And for the purpose of testing, I also can initialize each bin with an infinite amount of a resource. Anyway, here you can see this farm building at work. It's charged up by the leaves that the ants are placing in it, and then it plants some growing mushrooms. These mushrooms are worth food, and over time the ants can collect them for this food. Next up is the compost, which is similar to the farm but a little bit different. This one charges up with food rather than leaves, and when it triggers, it can fertilize some nearby plants. This fertilizing means basically that the plant is duplicated. And remember that you can harvest each of these plants multiple times, and therefore by duplicating them you're actually permanently increasing the size of your forest. In other words, you can gradually terraform the level, increasing the amount of resources in it. This also means that the farm and the compost connect into a loop, because the farm uses leaves to gain more food, then that food can be put into a compost, which can give you more sources of leaves. One of my design goals for the buildings is to make each building do multiple things wherever that's possible. That's because I don't want to have an enormous menu of different buildings that each do a very specific thing, because then you have to sift through that menu and try to find which one does that thing I need again, or it's a bit of a pain to find it. In other words, I think it's better to have fewer buildings that between them all have richer interactions. And this is why the compost can actually duplicate any plant resources, and therefore it can produce more than just leaves. It could produce fiber for making clothes or all sorts of things in the future potentially. Finally, let's talk about the sprinklers. The basic idea of the sprinkler is that you fill them up with water, and then they trigger, spraying water in a large area like this. And then any plants that get watered by this effect will suddenly start growing very quickly. In fact, they'll grow almost immediately, and this means that you can access their resources much faster. Conceptually, I really liked this idea, but in practice, it had a bit of a problem, which is that it was quite difficult to make the farms and the sprinklers overlap in a comfortable way. One way I thought about solving it was to have tall vertical farms, and then wide horizontal sprinklers that can sprinkle across multiple farms horizontally. But ultimately I didn't really like the way that the mushrooms looked here and the way that they're sort of cramped for space. So I went back to the drawing board and came up with a somewhat different concept. This time around, the farms are horizontal, and the mushrooms spawn on the row above them. This keeps all your mushrooms orderly and stops them from overlapping. And so long as you haven't built something directly above your farm, they can all grow to their full height as well, which will make them be worth more food. I also wanted to reinforce this leaf cutting theme by having these piles of leaves. As you fill up the farm and trigger its planting effect, a new leaf pile will appear each time. This effect was a little bit tricky to create because it meant that I had to split up all the graphics into these smaller sprites and then recombine them in Unity, which was a faff. It also needed some custom programming, which didn't quite go perfectly the first time around. But in the end, it turned out really well. I think that this new setup for farming is a lot more visually clear. And normally I don't like spending this much time on such detailed animations. It makes me feel like I'm perhaps losing sight of the big picture and the more important things I should be investing my time into, but in this case I did feel like it was necessary to show that leaf cutting inspiration as clearly as possible. Okay, so the farms are good. Let's now go back to the sprinklers. I designed a more compact sprinkler so it takes up less space and therefore gets less in the way of your farms. And I also added this well building so that the ants can have a source of water. In the future, maybe this well can also pump different kinds of liquids like, I don't know, mud or whatever other kinds of liquids ants come across in the wild, depending on what kind of terrain you place the well on. My plan here was to greatly expand the range of the sprinklers into a big circle, and this of course meant I had to update the particle effects to shoot in a 3D circle. And here you can see the new sprinkler in action. This larger range makes it much more effective at watering wild plants, as well as your farmed ones, and that again helps give the sprinkler more uses. These leafy plants do grow quite quickly, and so in this particular scenario the watering isn't much benefit, but I'm envisioning that other resources, like maybe potatoes or something, could grow a lot slower, and their watering will have a huge impact. I also made the ants headbutt the well to pump water up for the sprinkler, just like how a real well works. And with that, I think I'm pretty happy with the leaf cutting gameplay. But to turn this into a proper game prototype, we're going to need a bunch more stuff. First of all, it's essential to explain to the player how the game is actually played. And so I created some NPC characters, starting with this Queen Ant. I wanted her to have a fancy and royal feeling, so she's wearing a dress that has a big plush collar. And obviously, since ants don't have hair, I couldn't give her a hairstyle, but I did think maybe she can wear a small snail on her head that looks a little bit like a fancy updo. Now, of course, this means that the snail is going to have to be absolutely minuscule since it's on the head of an ant. But maybe it's a baby snail, and perhaps she has a servant that goes out to find baby snails to replace them every time they grow too large for her head. I don't know, it's a funny thought. I also wanted her to be richly animated, and that meant I had to once again split her into a whole bunch of different sprites that could then be recombined into a skeleton. Here you can see the hierarchy of this skeleton, and I can move around her head and arms and wings, and in fact even the snail has a movable head and eyes. And her body is also split up into a few sections as well. Altogether it's quite a lot of bones. And so instead of trying to animate all of these bones by hand, which is a tedious task and not something that I'm particularly the best at, I instead decided it's time to do some procedural animation, which basically means animate her using code. When this is done well, I think it can create a much more natural look than hand-tuned animation. Basically, my idea was to connect all of her bones using springs. Some of them sort of side-to-side motion springs, some of them angular springs, so they sort of rotate and bob up and down. Unity has a built-in physics system that includes springs of this sort, so I tried to use it, but no matter what I did, it just wouldn't work properly for me. Maybe it's because this character is stuck to the game's camera and the camera is tilted to a weird angle, or maybe it's something else, I'm not sure, but ultimately I decided I'd have to just code my own springs, which actually isn't as hard as you might expect. Basically, you just set a point that the bone is meant to follow, and it accelerates towards that point. This naturally results in it overshooting, and then it accelerates back, and it overshoots again, and so on. And then if you add some dampening over time, so each time it overshoots it sort of loses some speed, then that creates a very natural looking spring motion. You can also do something very similar with rotation. These bones keep track of how fast the character is moving from side to side, and then it takes that speed and adds it to the angle of the bone. And once the character stops moving, the bone will then spring back and forth in much the same way as I did previously. By applying this rotation spring to, honestly, most of the bones in the Queen, I got this very natural looking result. I like to have lots of layers of subtle motion like this because I feel like it makes the game as a whole feel more juicy and more alive. Now we need a dialogue bubble, so I made this graphic. If you look closely, you can see that the bubble is rippling with a gentle distortion. This helps dial up the juiciness even further. Next, we got to add some text to the bubble. And I wanted this text to have some subtle motion as well, but I found a pre-made asset on the asset store that would make it nice and easy. The text now has this little entrance animation, and it also has a sort of a sketchy, hand-drawn shifting effect as well. And once we put all of this together, I think the end result looks really good. I also have the ability to put particular effects on particular words, and this could be useful to add more personality to the characters. For example, I could make the ants obsessed with finding and eating candy, and then the word candy can have this rippling effect to make it stand out, and maybe the ants' expression could change on their faces as well. It's just an idea, there's a lot of possibilities here. I knew I'd also want some worker ant characters so the queen could have conversations instead of just giving you direct instructions all the time. And so I made this worker ant skeleton in the same way I made the queen, and then I connected 5 of them to make a little ant crowd. Worker ants obviously don't have much individuality, so they're going to do everything as a group. And with a little bit more effort and polish, I set up this example conversation script. When I showed this to the Discord server, people said the worker ants were creepy. And I kinda agree actually, they look a bit too much like real ants, and so I redrew them to be more in keeping with their small versions. This new version feels a lot better to me. They seem much less likely to murder me in my sleep. Now we've got to start integrating all of this into the gameplay. At the start of every level, my concept is to have an ant fly down from the top of the screen and build a new castle, which then becomes the centre of your colony. So I made this graphic for a mound of earth that can then transform into your castle. Then I took the queen ant from before and simplified it and made it much smaller, creating another new character. This little guy is called the mayor ant, and he represents you, the player. By using the same spring system, I was able to quickly give him a lot of character, and I also added a sound effect for his fluttering wings. This sound is constantly looping while he's on screen, and I can modify the volume and the pitch of the sound based on how fast he's moving, and this simulates the Doppler effect and makes him feel much more like a real flying insect, or perhaps a lightsaber. Then I made some special effects for the castle building animation, a digging effect, a sparkle effect, and a sound or two. Putting it all together, we've got this. Then I took it all a step further and added this victory animation for the end of the level. I thought it would be cute to make the mayor ant fly by your screen at the end, and in the future I could use this as part of a screen wipe transition to the next step of the game. And I also figured I may as well make a defeat animation as well. In the current prototype, there's no way to actually be defeated. That's because I've temporarily removed all of the hunting and combat mechanics so that I can focus more on the leaf cutting. But it will be useful in the future, so I figured may as well bang it out while I'm on the topic. You might have noticed that the castle is now a dark, dirty soil colour, instead of the yellowish clay colour that I've been using previously. That's because I want to let you level up your buildings over time. And so you'll improve their construction from soil to clay, and then to a sort of a baked clay, and then adding some greenery as well. I had a similar mechanic in a previous prototype, but the implementation of it was just a bit too fiddly and complicated. So I've come up with a simpler way to do this. As your ants bring resources back to their home, the home gains experience. And once that experience meter is full, the building will level up. And as a reward, you can get some additional ants each time you do this. Then I applied this same mechanic to the other sizes of ant homes, the small and the medium one. In the future, maybe I'll also apply it to other buildings like your wells or your farms, but it takes a long time to make all of these different graphic variations, and so I'm holding off on that idea for now. Alright, we're down to the final tweaks. I added a new growable mushroom type that you can find in the wild, and this gives a renewable source of food in some levels. And I also redrew the leafy plants to be bigger and bulkier, This makes them look much better in the level because you have smaller numbers of them, but each one is larger, and they clog up the screen much less. I also expanded the nugget system I talked about earlier so that it can support other kinds of nuggets. For example, this orange drops 2 orange slice nuggets when you break it, and these each give you a one-time boost of food. In the future, I'm also going to be using this mechanic for a range of other things, like, for example, hunting larger creatures like beetles or frogs. When you defeat them, their bodies can become nuggets that you then carry back home for food. And when you place a new building, I also made it so that the ants carry larvae to the building to supply it with more ants. This is a mechanic that was in one of the earlier prototypes, but I brought it back in a simpler form for this one. In the future, I want the game to encourage players to beat levels quickly and efficiently to earn better rewards. And so having mechanics that take a while, like the hauling of larvae or the heaving of these large nuggets, all of that is going to help slow down the gameplay a little bit. And this means that the game can have a real-time element that's encouraging you to play quickly, while also at the same time giving you downtime to think about your next actions and not make you feel like you're frantically clicking all of the time. Finally, I totally revamped your HUD based on all of the new gameplay mechanics. These victory milestones now look a lot neater and cleaner, and I've also renamed the coins so that they're instead called population. The logic of that works like this. Your colony must collect a lot of resources, and every time you hit a new resource milestone, the population of your colony increases, and this allows you to place new buildings and supply them with larvae. Taken as a whole like that, I think that this makes it easy to explain the gameplay loop to new players. And I've also let you sell your buildings to regain 1 population point from each one you sell. And then last of all, I tightened up the game's graphics just a bit, starting with these new level borders. They go around the edge of the level and just make it look a lot more natural, like you're in some sort of a small clearing in a forest. In the future, I'm going to use this mechanic to also set up walls in the middle of levels, so that I can create levels that have a more maze-like feel. But that's going to be a topic for another video. And because of this change, I also adjusted the game's entire colour palette. As I said earlier, one of the unique things about this game's art style is that I'm not using any outlines, and that means I have to be really careful with colour choices to make sure that things that are near each other have enough contrast. So for that reason, it helps a lot to make the ground colour very dark, because that then contrasts with a much wider range of colours. So I started with that, and then I tweaked everything else to look good relative to the ground, and I think that the result of all that is quite visually striking. Okay, you've waited long enough. Let's now watch some gameplay. You can try out the prototype for yourself by checking out the game's itch page. I've linked it in the doobly-doo below. This game will be coming to Steam when it's finished, but for now, itch is the only way to play it. It currently has 3 levels and a full introduction with dialogue and story events and all of that sort of stuff. So what's next? Well, I've got a whole bunch of different ideas cooking away for how this game can be expanded. I know that I want to add aphid farming because it's another very unique ant behaviour. And I also want to add beekeeping. I'm imagining some kind of an uneasy alliance between the ants and the bees, where your little beehives could give you a source of honey, but then sometimes maybe the bees attack you and you've got to defend the colony. I think that could be quite fun. And of course, ants are famous for hunting creatures that are much larger than themselves. And so I'd like to add some kind of large enemy that you can take on and hunt for its food. Honestly, I'm not really sure which of these to tackle next, so if you have a preference, leave it in the comments below. One last thing, I have finally chosen a name for this game. I gave some potential ideas in the last video with some mixed responses, and in return you guys gave me a lot of new ideas which honestly were very helpful, and ultimately I think that this new name I've chosen is really good. I'm going to call the game Anthill Village. Anthill because you are building an ant colony, of course, and village because these ants are human-like and have the technology level of a medieval village. I think that this name does a really good job of communicating each half of the game's concept. On the one hand, you've got this anthill simulation, and on the other hand, a village builder. There's also a little bit of rhyming between hill and vill. And with the name chosen, I've also been able to set up a Steam page. By the way, we currently don't have any wishlists, so if you want to help make Steam Senpai notice me, you can click the button. That's all I've got to show you for now, but I've got a bunch more videos cooking away, and so I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.